Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I'm Tim Broderick, the Chief Science Officer and a Senior Research Scientist here at IHMC. I will be co-hosting today's interview. Joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's founder and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all of the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Tim. Great to be here.
Today we have J.P. Errico, a scientist and inventor whose work focuses on neuroimmunology and the many ways it impacts cellular metabolism, inflammation, mental health, and even how we age. He is particularly known for his research on vagus nerve stimulation and recently authored the book, The Vagus Immune Connection: Harness Your Vagus Nerve to Manage Stress, Prevent Immune Dysregulation, and Avoid Chronic Disease. He is also the co-host of the podcast, The Health Upgrade.
JP has more than 250 patents and is a founder of ElectroCore, a company that specializes in neuromodulation and non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation. He has an undergraduate degree in aeronautical engineering from MIT. JP also holds graduate degrees in both law and mechanical materials engineering from Duke University.
Before we get to our interview with JP, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our win review comes from Daniel. He appreciated our recent interview with Dr. Rudy Tanzi. His review reads, "Thank you for this wonderful interview. As an undergraduate student and aspiring Alzheimer's researcher, this interview was incredibly insightful and the most elucidating I have seen at unmuddling the current state of Alzheimer's research. I hope to learn much more from Dr. Tanzi. His comments have already given me so much to think about."
Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to all our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to our interview with J.P. Errico.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hello, welcome to STEM Talk. This is Tim Broderick filling in for Don Kronegas. And joining us today is J.P. Errico. J.P., welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, JP, and
Hi.
Hello, Tim.
JP, you were born in Massachusetts, but grew up in New Jersey.
Yes.
As a kid, I understand you were very focused on academics as well as sports and weightlifting. I also understand that your grandparents played a very active role in your childhood.
They did. My mother's parents were very, very involved.
Around 7th grade, as I understand it, your school, much to their credit, realized that you were quite good at math. And actually, there was a group of other kids that were also very good at math. And impressively, the school hired a retired college professor to teach math there. That's probably not common. So I think you were fortunate in that regard.
I was.
Can you talk about this and the impact that this particular person had?
Yeah. What happened in 7th grade, the school started in 7th grade. It went through 12th grade. And a group of us really got pretty frustrated that we already knew the math that they were intending to teach us. So they decided to accelerate us into algebra and geometry and algebra 2 pretty quickly. But that, of course, meant that by the time we got to 10th, 11th, 12th grade, we were going to be doing things that nobody else in the school had done before. So they needed to bring in some additional help. And they brought in a guy who was a really, really nice person, really very thoughtful and a good educator. And so I had the opportunity to take, it took like 6 years worth of math while I was in high school. Spent a summer at Cornell doing some math at the college level and still was able to come back and take linear algebra and things like that in high school. So it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is awesome. I have to say I think nowadays it's really hard to find that kind of quality math and science education. at that point in a child's educational path.
Yeah, especially with COVID, what just happened with all these kids, being out of school for a year or two, depending on where you were in the country. And we were fortunate enough down here in Florida that we were only out of school for a month or two.
Yeah.
Very fortunate.
So then after high school, you headed off to MIT. What led you to MIT?
Actually, the desire to go to MIT, actually, believe it or not, started in fifth grade. I was sitting at a table with a couple other kids in math, and I turned to the teacher and I said, where does somebody go to college if they're good at math and science? And trust me, if she had said Caltech would have been where I went, because she said, well, MIT's the best. And so whether or not she was right or not, that was where I wanted to go. And from that point on, I really never deviated from that being my plan. Applied early, got in, and that was it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I was inspired by the early Apollo days, and I know you went to MIT, you set foot on campus as a freshman. Was it already preordained that you were going to go into aeronautical engineering? How did that come about?
No, actually, I had always really loved physics. And my plan had been to go to into physics. But when I got there, I started asking people why were there certain people or certain majors that had so many people in it versus others, and which ones were the hardest. And the people that I asked, again, said that the two most difficult majors were aeronautical engineering and electrical engineering. And so I said, well, then I'm going to double major. I'm going to do both. And getting an education at MIT, they tell you, is like trying to take a drink from a fire hydrant. Very easy to satisfy your thirst, but also very easy to drown. And I nearly did, trying to do both of those. So I picked aeronautical and stuck with it.
Good choice. We have a lot of friends in that department for decades. It's a really interesting department.
Yeah. It's waxed and waned in terms of the number of people in it. When I was there, it was about 1/8 of the whole school was in aeronautical. I think it's shrunk down a fair amount since then. But every once in a while, you see, wow, there's a lot more than I thought. So
yeah, it's still doing well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So circling back to your interest in physics, in high school, you used to scour the school library and bookstores looking for textbooks on physics and quantum mechanics, which I have to say is not normal for high school students, especially.
Oh, for sure, that's not normal. It's not normal for anybody, trust me.
But it's not good to be normal.
No,
exactly.
It's not.
I mean, Homer Simpson is normal.
Yeah.
So are there any books that inspired your obsession with physics?
Yeah, there were a couple. The one I actually have a copy of at home that I've given to my kids, and my younger daughter is the one who currently is the owner of it, is Robert Jastrow's Red Giants and White Dwarfs. It was a book about astrophysics, and I remember because I was sick. I got the flu or something like that, and I was home with 102 fever, and my mother was telling me I needed to sleep, and I just had the book open. I was reading that book, and I just was fascinated talking about how the cores of stars going through the various different stages got up to 10 million degrees, and then 30 million degrees, and then 100 million degrees, and I was thinking to myself, that is just so cool. So, just trying to understand what was going on in those different environments was really fascinating to me.
I'm just curious, any other ones? That one sounds interesting. That one would definitely is now on my list. But any others? Yeah,
there was another one called Black Holes and White Dwarfs. That was pretty cool. I don't remember who wrote that, but the book, the section of my library in high school that for these kind of books was pretty small. So I had to rely on getting out to the bookstore. And, you didn't have the internet back then. You didn't have the ability to stream all these documentaries. So every once in a while, there would be a Nova special that I would watch. And we had this old videotape machine. I would record it and watch it a few times. So I would say a couple of things really stuck out were I had the opportunity when I went to one of the summer programs that I did to actually learn special relativity while in high school. And that was really cool. We actually walked through the problems of, sort of the twin paradox, why that happens, et cetera. That was really fascinating. Learning the Lorentz contractions and understanding the geometry behind it was really cool.
The book you were thinking of by Tucholsky or something like that, or Russian-sounding name?
There is a book like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I've never read it. I've seen it. I had a colleague at NASA that had it on his table, and it had such a cool name.
Yeah.
I thought I should read that.
Yeah. It was a good book.
I confess I never did.
Wow.
So after MIT, you headed to Duke University, where you not only pursued a graduate degree in mechanical engineering, but also went to law school. I would suspect that kept you busy. You seem to be the kind of guy that likes to be busy. Did you do anything else when you were at Duke? Did you have a social life or any other fun?
Oh, well, absolutely. I actually won the English award at high school graduation as well as the math award. So I kind of been going in two different directions at once for a while. My mother went to law school. And so when I was thinking about what to do after MIT, I was thinking about maybe going to business school. I wanted to start companies, be involved in entrepreneurialism. And my mother said, listen, a business degree is interesting, but, half the people who go to Fortune 500 companies and become the CEOs are lawyers. So you might want to consider law school, and it's a little easier to get into right out of school. And so I applied, got into Duke and went to law school, and it was like culture shock for me. Because, at MIT, that fire hydrant of technology and science, and there is none of that at law school. I mean, I remember sitting in a contracts class, and the contracts professor wrote on the board, $5 minus $2.60 is $2.40, and then turned around to us and said, it is generally a bad idea for lawyers to do math in public. And I was just, I turned around like frustrated, and there was a girl sitting next to me. I just remember, her face was white as a ghost. I mean, she just completely didn't do math. And I thought, I am out of my element. So I walked over to the engineering school. It was actually a fun little story. I walked over, it was second semester of my first year of law school. And I walked over and I sat down in the dean of the department's office, Charles Harmon. And I said, I want to do a master's degree over here while I'm in law school. And he was an old guy from West Virginia. And he sort of just looked at me and said, we don't get a lot of lawyers over here. And it took me about an hour to convince him that I knew what I was talking about and that it would be a good idea. And he ended up being a big advocate of mine. And it was a great experience.
It's just crazy to me that nowadays with AI and the impact it's having and it's driving the economy, that someone in law school would actually make the comment that we don't do math very well as lawyers.
It's frightening.
It's generally true, but it's nothing to brag about.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because the law is supposed to be the truth. But at some fundamental level,
I laugh.
Well, ultimately it's supposed to be. Yeah. But at the end of the day, there's only one truth. And that truth is math. I mean, math is, science is a story that we tell to try to explain what we observe. And that story evolves over time. And it's always imperfect. But math is perfect. Math is the truth. So I thought it was kind of disturbing when a law professor's saying we can't do math. So anyway.
So while still in law school, you began working for a patent firm. When you earned your law degree, your uncle, who was at New York University, called you and said he had some lessons he wanted to run by you, and that ended up being a very fortuitous phone call.
It really was. He and I would see each other at holidays. It was about it. He was my godfather, but we didn't have that much interaction. But every time at Christmas time, while I was sort of thinking about going into patent law and doing some work in patent law, I would say to him, if you have any inventions, if you have any ideas in surgery, you should talk to me. And he didn't do it, and he had actually had a bad experience. He was asked to go over to Germany to do a 6-week fellowship, if you will, with a group of physicians, one of whom was pretty inventive himself. And when he got there, that surgeon and the engineer he was working with sort of collared him and said, hey, what do you think of this? And they laid out their designs for a new a pedicle screw to be used in spine surgery. And my uncle looked at it and said, well, yeah, I don't think it's going to work. And he sort of made some changes and, with a pen over their drawings. And about 8 months later, that product showed up on the market. And those two guys made a mint off that invention. And my uncle was frustrated about the fact that he got zero credit for the fact that what was actually employed was what he had done. So he didn't want that to happen again. So he took me up on it. He called me. I had literally been at the law firm that I was working at for maybe about 6 weeks. And he called me up on the phone and said, let's sit down and talk. I've got some ideas. And we did. We sat down at his house on a Sunday afternoon and spent about 4 hours with him walking through some videos of him doing surgery and what was going on. And as a result of that, we ended up patenting 5 different inventions that we came up that day. And then over the next couple of years, we ended up patenting 70 different things. And some of those ended up being multi-billion-dollar products on the market with some of the biggest medical device companies in the world, Medtronic, Synthase, which now became part of Johnson & Johnson, Stryker. And that sort of launched me into the medical space. I hadn't really intended to be, but I was in the medical device space for life at that point.
Yeah, I'm a surgeon by training, and I have to say I've had the opposite experience, similar to your father's first experience, where some of my ideas were then turned into great products that I ended up, I guess I can look on in a positive way and say I really helped patients, but I really did not receive any other benefits.
And that happens a lot, and that's unfortunate. It just takes having the right group of people around you at the right time. And my uncle was good at putting the right people in the right places. He knew what I was good at. He knew what he was good at. We actually had a guy who was a good draftsman that came in, helped us do some testing, some preliminary testing on some ideas. And the three of us really worked together as a great team for several years. It was somewhat unique. There's not a lot of people who have that. Even that guy over in Germany who swiped my uncle's idea, he was working with an engineer who also owned a machine shop. And that's how they made their way.
Yeah, usually the MDs and PhDs don't do too well with regards to claiming value so it's interesting that they did that. And I will say, just as an aside, it's great that you also got to do that with your father.
It was my uncle. My uncle, my godfather. Yeah. My father's also a physician. He's an OBGYN, and he was always in business. So I had that business sense, I think, from him as well. It was an interesting mix of characters that I've come across. I always say it's a very eclectic background that I've got.
And quite an accomplished family, it sounds like.
A lot of doctors and lawyers, I will definitely say that.
We have a lot of doctors in our family, too. Yeah. And not as many lawyers.
Yeah, well, it's an even mix. It's an even mix.
So for 2 decades now, your work has been focused on neuroimmunology, which is the study of how our immune system and our nervous systems interact. I've heard you mention that neuroimmunology is complicated stuff, and it affects a wide range of health issues, including inflammation, mental health, how we age. And I know, back into your English interest and success from your high school days, you've written a book. And the book is called The Vagus Immune Connection: Harness Your Vagus Nerve to Manage Stress, Prevent Immune Dysregulation, and Avoid Chronic Disease. And in this book, you say that every person should have some understanding of neuroimmunology in order to live a healthy life. Can you touch on some of the key aspects that the listeners should know?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let's start by unpacking. I got interested in neuroimmunology because my sister was diagnosed with MS. And this actually was around the time that I was doing the work in the spine surgery. My uncle actually was the person who helped get my sister her diagnosis. So I became fascinated with it. I actually went back to school to study immunology. I went to the University of Washington out in Seattle. I was about to start that PhD program out there, and my uncle called me up to come back to the East Coast to start another company, which I did. But I was always interested in that field, and I had done a tremendous amount of independent study in the field. So one of the things that happened along the way while we were doing this work in the spine field was he introduced me to a guy, Dr. Ali Rezai, who was at one of the schools that's one of the hospitals that's part of the NYU chain. It's the Hospital for Joint Diseases in New York. And he was doing deep brain stimulation for things like Parkinson's and essential tremor and other movement disorders. And I was working with him to help him patent some of the ideas that he was coming up with. And along the way, he he showed me what he was doing, and I thought it was magical. I mean, literally to be able to flip a switch and turn a person from, with really florid symptoms of Parkinson's disease, shaking, et cetera, to literally not shaking at all and looking absolutely normal and functioning normally. And so I wanted to get back into that space. And it took about 4 or 5 years before I was able to really dedicate the time and effort into the space. And unfortunately, Ali had moved on to Cleveland Clinic, and so he wasn't in the area anymore. So I sort of had to do it by myself with some guidance from my uncle, but that's not really his space. And so that's how I got into the field. Along the way, while in the field, I've come to realize that stimulating the nervous system the right way also activates multiple other systems in the body. One of them is the immune system. Another is your cellular metabolism. It also has a pretty profound effect on your microbiome. And when I think of the 4 systems, or the 4 most fundamental pillars on which all of life really resides and functions, it's your immune system, it's your cellular metabolism, it's your microbiome, how you interact with your environment, and it's your autonomic nervous system. And the fact that your autonomic nervous system has the ability to control those other 3 systems really puts it at the most fundamental level, the most important thing that you can know about your health. And I'm in the process right now of putting together a paper with a group of researchers I'm working with around how aging itself is really a function of a slow deregulation of your autonomic nervous system. In fact, the theory that we're postulating is that it's the autonomic deregulation theory, because all of the other hallmarks of aging are really a function of how your autonomic nervous system allows those systems to fail.
Yeah, fascinating. I wholeheartedly agree. I will throw in one other area, and I think that's critically important, obviously, for us throughout our lifespan, health span, is the neurologic mental health space. Mm-hmm. Obviously, which vagus nerve stimulation does have a big impact, or can have a big impact on that as well. And I won't touch on this. It's maybe a topic for a future conversation, but I think that it's very interesting, the epigenetic related changes. So the impact that your vagus nerve and the autonomic nerve system have is based somewhat on our genes, but it's also sort of translated into our life by the changes in the way our genes are stored and read out, called epigenetics.
Yeah, just to dig into it, I know maybe it isn't the topic for today, but let's just dig into it a little bit because it's fascinating. At the end of the day, and this is work that Kevin Tracy pioneered, I'll tell you the story about how I sort of drafted off him inadvertently, but really a lot of credit, a tremendous amount of credit goes to Kevin Tracy for deciphering what it is that the vagus nerve does in the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. I think the most important thing about that he discovered is actually his team discovered the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor and its role. One of the most fascinating aspects of it is the fact that it doesn't just sit on immune cells, and it isn't just the conduit through which the nervous system affects immune cells. It actually sits on the surface of mitochondria. And so that same receptor, I mean, how many receptors out there are on both the extracellular membrane and on the mitochondrial membrane? That, to me, the outer membrane, it's fascinating. But it allows your autonomic nervous system to have control over the immune system and inflammation, as well as cellular metabolism and controlling mitochondrial function. And those 2 things, you talked about mental health, those 2 things are critically important in how your brain functions. And I'm sure we're going to get into it, but inflammation is really the underlying problem that's driving neurotransmitter imbalance and microglial dysfunction. And microglial dysfunction is really, really important. And what microglia do and how they interact with mitochondria in neurons. I mean, they're just now discovering that your microglial cells can actually change out the mitochondria inside neurons. They actually swap them, and then the mitochondria in the neuron is healthy, and now the microglial cell goes and spits out the bad mitochondria into the bloodstream, and your kidneys, it goes out through your kidneys, and you excrete bad mitochondria from your brain. So all of that is regulated and controlled by your autonomic nervous system and your inflammation state.
For our listeners, we had Kevin Tracy on STEM Talk, episode 172. So these two episodes will jointly reinforce each other and kind of go together quite nicely.
He's a brilliant guy.
Yeah, he was a great guest,
he's a really
too.
Brilliant guy.
He was sharp, insightful.
Let me just say, I there's no question in the grand scheme of things, he's like the Isaac Newton of this space. If I had to put a name on me, it'd be sort of like Leibniz. I'm like the little guy who, I also did it, but I did it after he did it, and I did it in a different way, and I didn't also, by the way, solve, all of mechanics and orbital mechanics and come at. What I did was basically take that idea that Ali Rezai had, which was that anytime anybody's ever cut a nerve and gained a clinical benefit from that, then you could maybe stimulate the nerve and do the same thing. And it was literally that little nugget of an idea that was sitting in the back of my brain 4 years hence from when he told it to me. I was sitting at home. My wife was downstairs trying to rearrange the kitchen of my bachelor pad. And I didn't want to go down. We were recently married. And I just was hiding up in my office, working and trying to come up with something to do. And I decided to do a little web search on cutting nerves, see where there was a benefit. And I came up with this article. It was out of the old Soviet Union. They had taken dogs. They had taken the dogs and turned them into allergic animals. So they were allergic to egg white. And what they did was they took a half of those animals and they cut the vagus nerve. And then they took all the animals and they exposed them to what would be a lethal dose of an allergen. The dogs that had the vagus nerve cut survived. And so I literally put one and one together and, maybe I got three, because what I said was, let's go stimulate the vagus nerve and see if we can stop this anaphylactic reaction. And it worked. It worked. We did it at Columbia University back in 2006. Now, I was utterly unaware of Kevin Tracy at the time. So what we did was reinvent something that he had invented and figured out 5 years earlier. What we then did was figured out how to do it in a way that I think is more, more user-friendly, in that it's a handheld device you can use, in the privacy of your own home. Everything up to that point needed to be implanted. In fact, our original work was in using an implant, but we were treating something that was an acute problem. So whereas vagus nerve stimulation had previously been developed for treating epilepsy and depression, which were chronic conditions where implanting something in the body made sense, we were treating something that was sort of a one-off, where you didn't want to necessarily have an implanted device inside you. You wanted to be able to do something with a handheld device to treat it right away and then move on. And so we needed to figure out how to do it non-invasively so that there wasn't a surgery involved, because who's going to spend $30,000 to treat an anaphylactic reaction when there's an EpiPen?
Yeah, it's fascinating. First, I will say Kevin Tracy is amazing. And it's also interesting that as a neurosurgeon, he was working on the vagus nerve. I can say 3 decades ago, as a practicing general trauma surgeon, we did not have great treatments for ulcers, gastric ulcers, stomach ulcers, and we divided the vagus nerve. I wrote a book chapter in one of the surgical textbooks on cutting the vagus nerve. The challenge with that is anytime you do a surgery, you obviously have complications related to that, and cutting a nerve is permanent. I would see the patients come back with no longer having ulcers, but you have complications related to having your vagus nerve cut.
Did you see depression as one of them?
Some of the patients, because they went through, were, I can't say whether or not it's because we cut their vagus nerve, but having had a fairly large incision in their abdomen and the problems that they have, there were a number of people who were depressed.
The reason I ask is because I've always been fascinated by the fact that there was one of the most horrific accidents that ever occurred in sports was the Buffalo Sabres goalie who had his throat cut during a hockey game. I mean, it was just a freak accident. Guy lost balance, slid into him, skate up, hit him in the neck, cut his carotid artery. I mean, he is bleeding out on the ice. But there was an EMT who happened to be on the side, in the stands, or was actually part of the team as a trainer, jumped over to literally put his finger in and blocked the bleeding, and they were able to sew it up. But afterwards, that guy the goalie suffered crippling depression. And it wasn't really because of the trauma of the accident. I think it's because he had his vagus nerve severed. I think during that accident, his vagus nerve was injured, and as a result, he suffered mental health problems.
I believe that. So that's cervical vagus. In our general surgery procedures, we would cut the vagus in the lower part of the esophagus as it goes in. Mm-hmm. It still has an impact because there's afferent and efferent, so it goes both ways, the traffic on the nerve, but it's farther down. And so, I believe based on some of the work that we've done that I'm excited to talk to you about with stimulating the vagus nerve in the neck, I do believe it has an impact on depression and other mental health.
Another area where you had interest and impact with respect to stimulating the vagus nerve has to do with a problem a lot of people have, but they're typically not treated effectively, is asthma. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as a follow-on to the work we were doing in anaphylactic shock, the research anesthesiologist that we were working with at Columbia University Hospital in New York, shout out to Chaz Amala, he was the leader of that group. He noted that what he was seeing in the animals was a remaining patent opening of the airways. The airways normally in these anaphylactic reactions would swell up and you'd get bronchospasm as well as edema. And what he said was that the airways were remaining open. And I remember I was sitting at a Nets game in New Jersey, and I said, well, do you think that we could treat asthma with this? And what, unbeknownst to me, they had actually been using vagus nerve stimulation to cause asthma, to study pharmaceutical products.
Asthma?
So because you can cause bronchospasm. You can cause, if you stimulate the C fibers, you can cause bronchoconstriction. What they had never done was lower the amplitude down to the point where you weren't stimulating the C fibers, you were only stimulating the A fibers, and see whether or not it would be bronchodilatory. And so what we did was, we went in and we said, okay, let's do a methacholine challenge. Methacholine is a chemical that will trigger bronchospasm. And we showed that we could, in both a histamine challenge and a methacholine challenge, we could blunt an asthma attack. We could reverse it as quickly as albuterol. And actually, for a longer lasting period, with a short burst of stimulation, we could effectively, I don't want to say immunize, but effectively blunt the impact of the triggers for a really long time. And so that led us to doing our first clinical work in humans, which was in the emergency department. And as I said before, we originally had it with a percutaneous device. So these were patients who had failed albuterol at home. They had failed their nebulized treatments in the ER or in the ED, and they were literally hunched over, struggling to breathe. You could hear them wheezing. They were on the way to being, admitted to the hospital and potentially intubated. And I didn't realize, but I looked it up. People who are admitted to the hospital, so they've left their medication at home, they've gone to the ER, the ER's treated them, they're not getting better. After 24 hours, they end up having to be admitted. People who are admitted to the hospital for asthma, and there are hundreds of thousands of them per year, end up spending more time in the hospital for that problem than a person who's having a full one-level fusion, spinal fusion. And I said, this might be a market here. There might be a real market here for this. So we started with percutaneous sticking of a deep brain lead, basically in the vicinity, under ultrasound guidance, in the vicinity of the vagus nerve, which basically sits between the carotid artery and the jugular. So it's right there in a pretty important part of your neck. We always used to joke that we'd have the interns do it because they would miss, like an IJ stick, but miss. Yeah. And so they'd get it in the neck, and then we had an external box. And it was amazing to watch these people. They were hunched over, struggling to breathe, and then you'd sort of stick the lead in the neck, and then you'd attach to the box, and you'd turn up the amplitude, and slowly but surely, you'd see no change, and then all of a sudden, at one point, they would just suddenly sit back and be able to breathe normally. And they would look at you with wide eyes saying, "What did you do?"
It's magic.
It really, it honestly, it was. I'll tell you, one of the coolest things that I've actually been a witness to personally is the very first time we took that idea, that knowledge that we had about doing this with a percutaneous stick, figuring out how to make it non-invasive. And we were sitting at the office, and we had bought this $80,000 machine, and we had figured out how to reprogram it so it could actually deliver the signal that we needed it to, which meant that it only lasted for 2 minutes before it literally conked out because it was overheating. But there was a guy in our office named John, and he still works for the company, John Gardner, and he has asthma. And he was sitting there in his office. He's a draftsman. He's an engineer. And I was talking with him, and I could hear him wheezing. I mean, he was really struggling to breathe. And I said, "John, use your albuterol." He says, "I hate that stuff." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, it makes my heart race, makes me feel jittery. Mm-hmm. I hate using it. And I said, "Well, I mean, would you be willing to try this?" And he said, "Yeah, let's do it." And, then I thought to myself, do we have somebody here's a medical doctor that we can actually do this? But we did. We actually had an anesthesiologist at our offices at the time, and she agreed to monitor this. And so we took this nerve conduction velocity machine, which had a paddle that was about, 18 inches long, and he held it up to his neck, and he's moving it around, and so I could feel it in my ear, I could feel it in my jaw, I could feel it in my teeth, and then he hit this spot. And he got this shocked look on his face. He sat back and he says, "It's gone." And I said, "What's gone?" And then without answering, he starts hyperventilating. And I'm looking at him like, "Oh my God, what do we do?" And I said, "What are you doing? What's going on?" And he said, "I can usually trigger an asthma attack by hyperventilating." And he said, "And I can't do it." And I said, "Well, what's going on?" He said, "It got rid of my asthma attack. My asthma attack is gone. And I can't trigger another one." And that was just sort of like magical watching that happen. And I've seen it so many times at this point where a person's wheezing and struggling and put the device up to the neck and it stops.
Yeah. For context, what year was that?
That was probably 2009, because we then went through a process of developing the first, what we actually called AlphaCore. AlphaCore was our first version. It was a mini version, basically, of this giant nerve conduction velocity thing. We had a machine that was pretty portable. It was kind of portable. It was external, but it was definitely a high voltage machine, and it worked. We actually did a clinical study with it down in South Africa. And as I think I mentioned before we got on the air, a lot of people will say, how do you know you're stimulating the vagus nerve? Well, we've done 10 different lines of research to show that we are. But specifically, I mean, the easiest one to think about was we did a clinical study in which we used a percutaneous needle, a stick with an electrode sitting right next to the vagus nerve, really no different than the implantable devices. Yeah. And the clinical results were very clear. I mean, we had, graphs of improvement in work of breathing and FEV1, et cetera. And then we did exactly the same protocol in a study where we used a non-invasive approach, and we got exactly the same clinical results. So, I mean, there's not much, I'm sorry, ring the bell there, but, pretty obvious that we were doing exactly the same thing non-invasively. So it was pretty neat. And the effects lasted for a long time. I mean, they lasted for anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. You'd see people who have asthma who aren't necessarily having an attack use the device, and they'll say, "God, my lungs feel like they're 10 feet wide. I feel like I can breathe. I can't believe I'm walking around constricted all the time, because if this is what it's like to breathe normally," and that lasts for about 6 hours.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
So, armed with the knowledge that a non-invasive approach to vagus nerve stimulation was possible, you started searching for ways to optimize a delivery device. And this led to a device you named GammaCore. Can you describe GammaCore and how it worked?
Yeah, so the alpha core, as I mentioned, was this rather involved modulating A fields in order to induce a current in the neck. But we recognized that wasn't the easiest way to go about this. We hit on a couple of other ways. My good friend Bruce Simon, the VP of research at Electrocore, he came up with a pediatric nasal gastric tube in which he put a semi-porous bag, inflatable bag on the end of it so that he could snake it down through his nose down into your esophagus, inflate the bag with saline, and there was an electrode in there and he could stimulate from inside the esophagus. I have to tell you, that is the most uncomfortable thing I have ever volunteered to do. Except he had a turbinectomy. So his nasal passages were basically like a highway. So for him to just snake it down into his esophagus was easy. For everybody else, I mean, you're tearing up. It's just really it's not okay. So that was one way we didn't do. But we came up with GammaCore, which is basically, it's a very simple oscillating field that is tuned to 5,000 hertz. It's a sine wave. So the reason for the sine wave is that you want to, charge balance. Most of the external stimulators and most of the internal stimulators that are out there use square waves. And square waves, you'll have a large positive pulse. And then there's this charge balancing small negative charge that is being delivered for some extended period of time that has to charge balance. We don't have to do that. We have a sine wave, so it's going positive and negative for a brief period of time at 5,000 hertz for 1 millisecond. And interestingly, you would say, well, if it's charge balanced, how do you know that you're actually activating the nerve? And the answer appears to be that there is an asymmetry in the flow of ions into and out from a nerve. So the channels and the gates that are bringing charge into the nerve and loading it up and charging up the nerve happen very easily. Getting that charge back out when it's in the negative of the curve is slow. So even though you've got the field there pushing the charge in the other direction, it doesn't go. So you actually have this sort of step function. What the nerve is actually seeing is a step function. It's going up and up and up, and then it fires. And then it goes through the refractory period. And it's that refractory period where we're off. So it's a 5,000 hertz sine waves that lasts for 1 millisecond. So you're getting 5 of the cycles. And then it's off for 39 milliseconds, then on again. And that appears to have the same effect as the square wave 1 millisecond pulse that the implantable devices do.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
Yeah, and for our listeners, because you're talking about putting electricity through a device into your neck. Mm-hmm. Just, do you mind comment? This is like safe and it's not painful for the patients, but do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people know what TENS units are. People know what, people have probably not done this and don't do it. But for those of you out there who've been like me and interested, stick your tongue on the end of a battery. It's going to tingle. It's not fun, but what the reason for the 5,000 hertz sine wave is that the skin has pain receptors and the skin has resistance and capacitance. When you have a very high frequency sine wave, that effectively short circuits the capacitance of the skin, and you get the signal through the skin much, much more effectively at higher amplitudes. And it doesn't appear to activate the pain receptors. What you feel is like a little tingling, and that tingling reaches sort of a maximum, and then it really never gets any stronger. At that point, you start to feel the muscle in your neck So you know where to position it because you want to be just inside that muscle. It's going to flex a little bit, but you want to be inside that muscle, right where you would feel for your pulse.
As an aside, and I'm just wondering if you felt like your work and the work of others in vagus nerve stimulation inspired these devices you're seeing now for orthopedic pain. You're seeing devices that a coil is implanted maybe in the knee, right on it, the nerve. Mm-hmm. And then all night long it's stimulated. You wear sort of a wrap over the knee and it pings that nerve all night. You take it off during the day and people report a great diminution in pain during the day, and they hook up again the following night.
Yeah, I think those things work. In fact, Electrocore, which I'm not, I don't work for anymore. I founded the company. I was involved, but I'm not on the board of directors. I'm not involved in other than doing some consulting for them. I understand that they just purchased a product. Actually, I think they purchased a product from a company that is called Quell, which is one of those products that stimulates, as you said, around the knee. It's for pain. Mm-hmm. I think those things work. I think there's no question. I don't think they work by the same mechanism by any stretch. I think the vagus nerve is unique mm-hmm. in that it is activating pathways involved with the immune system and with cellular metabolism that are different. But I do think that those things work. And I think that by either numbing or otherwise blocking pain signals, it does allow the brain to rewire. The brain is going to, rewire itself based on what it's experiencing. In fact, one of the things that I've been a big advocate for is using vagus nerve stimulation for its neuroplasticity enhancement benefits. One of the studies that I really focused a lot of attention on that we did, and I would love to see us continue this work, was early on, we went over to the UK where we were able to contract with some clinical pharmacists. And the clinical pharmacists were able to go into the medical records and extract out of the medical records data about individual patients and then pseudonymize it for us to be able to understand what was going on and then potentially identify patients that could participate in clinical studies. And the thing that I was interested in was because we at that point we had already moved into headache as a clinical indication for our product. I wanted to find out why headache patients seem to cost a lot of money. And what I mean by that is that if a person is suffering with depression, well, then there is a medical cost associated with that. And the research will tell you it's in the thousands of dollars, a few $1,000s per year to manage a person who has depression. But if that person is comorbid with migraines, it quadruples the cost. The papers that I'm referring to are back from the early 2000s, but they seem to show that a person with depression costs $3,500 more than normal. When they have migraines, it's $12,000. Yeah. And I was trying to understand that dynamic because that was something that we could say that, if we can treat the headache, maybe we're going to reduce the cost of these patients. And so we went over to the UK and we identified that, in fact, there are about 5 or 6 what I'm going to call sort of comorbid symptoms. And I won't even call them conditions because I think they're symptoms. Comorbid symptoms of what I'm going to call the sick program. When you get sick with the flu, for example, you've got achiness, all over body pain, widespread pain, like fibromyalgia, maybe not as bad, but it's achiness. You've got headaches. You've got stomach upset. You've got, IBS-like symptoms. You've got a disruption of your sleep. You've got all of these symptoms that are pretty, people would say, yeah, you've got the flu, or you've got the stomach bug, you've got something in you. But when patients say, yeah, but I've experienced these same symptoms for 5 years straight, that's the point at which most physicians, want to, get the holy water and a cross and back out of the room, gingerly. But the dirty little secret is that they've got 200 patients in their practice that are like that. And what we're trying to identify is why there are people like that. And so we did a study, and what we found was that there's about 10%, 10 to 12% of the population that fits this story, that they've got this sick program running in them. And it's an autonomic nervous system response to a prolonged period of inflammation. And in fact, we do animal studies that trigger these symptoms in animals by exposing them to inflammation for a prolonged period of time. That's why people are experiencing long COVID. Long COVID is a consequence of the neuroplastic changes that take place in the brainstem as a result of exposure to inflammation for a prolonged period of time. If you had a brief bout of COVID, your chances of having long COVID are very small. If you had a long period of COVID, had some breathing difficulties, went to the hospital, it gets progressively more likely that you're going to have long COVID symptoms because the period of inflammation that you went through was longer. So what we're showing is that you can reverse that by using vagus nerve stimulation to enhance the neuroplasticity of the brain to be able to revert out of that sick program back into normal perception.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Back in the day, around the time when I was at DARPA, there was a couple of programs that were started. DARPA, for the listeners that don't know, as developer creation and prevention of technological surprise, the innovation engine of the United States.
The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Yes.
It's the real world, we'll call it the Tony Stark labs of
So you hear about it, in the Marvel movies or in games. You see a lot in video games. So there were a couple of bioelectronic programs. One was called Targeted Neuroplasticity Training, or TNT. And the other one was called Electrics. And along the lines of the nervous system stimulation, it was realized by the program manager that started those, Doug Weber, around that time, that if you take the nervous system and you design a device in the right way and change the stimulation protocols so that they're appropriate, you can impact the nervous system in different ways. So one was the vagus nerve. The other they looked at, for example, was trying to mitigate phantom pain in those that have had an amputation. You could also change the perception in the pain. And by the way, I will say, if you have enough pain, everybody gets depressed. So,
But depression, just briefly on that, because I know where you're going, and I'm looking forward to the discussion about the work that the TNT program resulted in. But there's a theory in medicine called sort of the monoamine theory of depression and mental health. And basically, the suggestion is that you don't have enough serotonin or enough norepinephrine. I think that it's expanding also to look at dopamine, but that somehow there's not enough of these neurotransmitters being available, and that medications that block the reuptake of that neurotransmitter into the cell is the solution. Now, just maybe to give a little explanation about there. So when the nerve fires, there's a release of neurotransmitter. It's in the synaptic cleft. That neurotransmitter needs to get taken back up. And in some cases, it's taken back up by the presynaptic terminal. Sometimes it's taken up by the astrocyte. Sometimes it's taken up by the postsynaptic terminal. But in any event, it's cleared out. And the idea is that if serotonin is being released and that's the problem, that we don't have enough of it, then we should just leave it out there longer. That doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't make any sense. The problem is you don't have enough. Well, let's figure out why you don't have enough. And the answer is that serotonin is synthesized in the nerve cell from tryptophan. Tryptophan is the precursor amino acid from which serotonin is made. It's a two-step process. That process doesn't have to go in that direction. It can also go in a different direction, where tryptophan is the precursor for making a whole slew of other chemicals, starting with kynurenine and kynureninic acid or whatever, all the way down to quinolinic acid, which is the penultimate end of that pathway. It actually ends up in NADPH, which is really important for mitochondrial function. But all of those chemicals, from kynurenine all the way down to quinolinic acid, are free radical promoters. So when there's inflammation, if you think about it from the standpoint of sort of anthropomorphize your cell, there's inflammation around. The cell's picking up on that signal. It says, why would there be inflammation? Maybe there's a bug or a virus around. How can I make my cell, inhospitable to that bug? Well, the best way to do that is to make more free radicals, make more reactive oxygen species. Well, how can I do that? Well, one thing I can do is stop making serotonin, and I can start making more of these free radical promoters. Well, that's good. Well, what happens when you don't make serotonin? Well, one of the things is it changes your mood. The other thing is that serotonin is a precursor for making melatonin. And everybody knows melatonin is the sleep hormone. But pretty much every cell in your body is making melatonin. And the reason why is because it is one of the most important antioxidants for your mitochondria. And so you say, okay, so now I'm not making melatonin, so my mitochondria are getting a little dysfunctional. What happens when they get dysfunctional? They produce more free radicals. They produce more reactive oxygen species. So you can see why, if there's inflammation, the cell's response is stop making serotonin. Because I don't want to make melatonin, I want to make more free radicals, and I want to make free radical promoters so that I can defend myself. That's fine for a short period of time, but over the long term, that makes your mitochondria dysfunctional and actually ends up killing the cell.
It makes sense, actually. Your perspective on that seems to make sense to me. Today we've talked about how stimulating the vagus nerve has, pleiotropic beneficial effects, and not very many topics fall into that without raising people's suspicion, right?
Yeah.
This is just true, right? We know it's true. And I thought, you've hit on a whole bunch of the potential applications, and there are many others we don't have time to hit on today. So I thought this would be a good time to step back for a minute and give the listener an idea of why this is the case. You've touched on each instance, but why is it the case that stimulating the vagus nerve has this tremendous breadth and application?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said before, which is that there really are only a small subset of systems and things that are going on in the body that really sort of are the linchpins, the fundamental pillars on which our health resides. And they are your immune system and immune system function. And we can dig into that a little bit more and once I complete this thought. But basically, your immune system, your mitochondrial function, your metabolism inside the cell, and your microbiome. And all of those three things are regulated by your autonomic nervous system. When you're in fight or flight mode, when you're in that sympathetic activated state, that sympathetic overdrive, that's healthy for a short period of time. But you have to get back into a state of parasympathetic recovery. And if you don't, then what happens is that good stress that you're experiencing, like if you go on a run or you go play basketball or you go, do something stressful like work really hard on a project, that's fine. That's wonderful. That's actually really good for you. It's hormetic. It's giving you a little bit of stress so that you can become stronger. But just like going out and running, go out and run 10 miles, bully for you. That's awesome. Go out and run 100 miles. Probably not so good. Run 1,000 miles, you're going to be dead. Okay? Your body can't handle it. Same thing with being in that fight or flight state. Short periods of time, good. That's awesome. Kids love being scared. They love doing, roller coasters. That's because they're instinctively, they like that. But you don't want to be on a roller coaster for 5 hours. That's going to cause problems.
Or for months.
Or months, exactly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of society, especially over the last 30 years, has been driving us, Western culture has been driving us into a perpetual state of sympathetic overdrive because your autonomic nervous system and your immune system don't care whether or not it's a lion that's chasing you or a deadline. Either one, a work deadline, either one of those things is going to trigger an immune response. Either one of those things is going to trigger you into that fight or flight state. You have to turn off the phones, get some exercise, get good rest. I mean, there's a huge movement right now. I think we're all aware of it, the Make America Healthy movement around, making certain that our diet is healthy and that we're not loading up our processed foods with additives that are bad for us. All of that is, it's not hype, it's real. I mean, we've known this for 10,000 years. Diet, exercise, and sleep. That's 99% of your health. when you stimulate the vagus nerve, you're stimulating the parasympathetic branch. And the parasympathetic branch is what is going to downregulate inflammation. It's going to support mitochondrial function, shift it back into a state where it's not producing lots of reactive oxygen species. One of the things that I'm personally studying right now is whether or not you're actually increasing ketone expression when you stimulate the vagus nerve. There was a great paper. It's a paper by Thomas Seyfried, and his graduate student's last name was Green.
Yeah.
Came out in like 2002.
We know him, yeah.
Yeah, and we did a podcast with him. He's a brilliant guy. But one of the things that he was studying was epilepsy, and what he looked at was vagus nerve stimulation in the context of ketone expression, because ketogenic diet is well known for treating epilepsy. He hypothesized in that paper or suggested that the reason why vagus nerve stimulation was having its effect in epilepsy might be that it was increasing ketone expression. Now, I believe that that's not the primary mechanism. I don't think it is. However, my suspicion is, and my bias is, that if ketone expression is positive, then it's also happening. Because there's no reason why doing something fundamental like stimulating the parasympathetic wouldn't do all of those things simultaneously.
Yeah, and we don't know which way the directional causality runs. I mean,
it's bidirectional,
when people report effects of being in deep ketosis, some of those effects seem very similar to the effects that you're describing.
Right.
So it's probably a bidirectional relationship there.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
No, I think so.
And I think there's an opportunity for synergism potentially there too, for ketone esters, supplementation and vagal nerve stimulation.
Yeah.
When you do vagal nerve stimulation, have you looked at, or I'm sure probably lots of people have looked at it, heart rate variability, the effect on heart rate variability? When one would imagine you would see a measurable effect. Is that true or
we do.
Not true?
We do. We've actually done multiple studies on this. And, now with the proliferation of Oura rings and Whoop watches and things like that, we're getting lots of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you see changes in heart rate variability that continue. It's not just like an immediate thing. It's continuing to get better over the weeks and months of people using it. I mean, I've got one guy who's talking about the fact that his heart rate variability was, on whatever measurement tool he had, it was like around 30, and now it's like 75. So he's pretty
big difference.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I don't know why this is the case, but I'm going to tell you an anecdote. We did a study for DARPA. It's called Learning Through Electrical Augmentation of Plasticity using the GammaCore device. And essentially what DARPA was asking for, patients had noted that when they were treating their asthma or some other disease that was FDA-approved indication, that their mood was better, that they were maybe learning a little bit better. And so DARPA put this call out. This is the targeted neuroplasticity training program that we talked about earlier. And they wanted to potentially use vagal nerve stimulation to improve learning. And so we at IHMC led a team that, in fact, found that vagus nerve stimulation improved second language learning and mood in students in the Defense Language Institute. And the interesting part of that was we saw effects for months. It was a great surprise. First, we didn't know if it was going to work. It did work. Very rigorous. It worked. It's now being used by, people across the military. But the fact that you could see effects out for months was astounding to me. And so it worked so well, in fact, that we started to have people that weren't involved in the study calling us and saying, hey, where can we get a device, and what settings should we use to have maximal effect for us? And so when people call you, because you're a leader, and what do you tell them?
So I tell them to use it twice a day for 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening. Just put it next to your toothbrush or put it next to your night table. It's pretty simple to use, 2 minutes, and you're done. It'll help you sleep better. It'll help you do lots of things. It'll make you feel better. But specifically with respect to the cognitive improvement functions, the brain is literally built by your immune cells. Okay, an embryonic day 7.5, which is measured in mice, so it's not exactly 7.5 in humans, but very early on there is an exodus of immune cells from the yolk sac, which is inside that placental ball at that point, into the embryo, into an area called the neural tube. The neural tube is where the brain is going to be, but there's nothing there. And those cells begin to construct the brain. They literally every aspect you can imagine of brain development is controlled by these immune cells, which are microglial cells. I mean, they literally were thought to be just glue, but they are so important for every aspect of your neural function. In fact, I say that the brain is actually your primary immune organ. It's your proactive immune system. And what we do with vagus nerve stimulation is we ensure that they remain in the state that they need to be in order to do all the things that they're supposed to develop a brain. And so this ties into some work that I'm also doing on autism and on other neurodevelopmental conditions, looking to see whether or not we can prevent it or minimize the rate at which autism is occurring, which is astronomical right now, by reducing inflammation in the pregnant mother, so that during that all-important neurodevelopment in utero, there's very little inflammatory signaling going on. So that work is ongoing right now. There's also work that I think needs to be done that is I'm very motivated to do, which is that I think that vagus nerve stimulation doesn't just temporarily alter how the brain is functioning with respect to learning. It is actually fundamentally changing the architecture of the brain. So, and here's why. The same neurodevelopmental job that those microglial cells are doing through brain development continues in certain regions of your brain, including your hippocampus, for your entire life. And your hippocampus is where you're generating new neurons, you're integrating those neurons into the network, you're ensuring that they're making the right connections and that those connections are being tested regularly for whether or not they should remain, whether there should be long-term potentiation to sort of, it's like that's sort of like the bike going through the same path in the forest. You're going to create a road. You want to use long-term potentiation to reinforce those connections or to literally, downregulate and get rid of them. All of that is being done by microglial cells. If there is inflammation present, they will not do that job. They will change their conformation. They will change what their activity is. They'll change their chemical signatures. All of it changes and they're not doing their job. If you can downregulate that inflammation, then those microglial cells will do their job more effectively and you will learn faster. What you've learned will remain longer. You will be able to recall it more efficiently. So yes, vagus nerve stimulation, by its downregulation of inflammation, is making your brain better. It is optimizing brain development. And my observations are, and at this point it's just observational, is that if you do this in children, when neurodevelopment is 100 times more important than it is for us, old guys, when you're doing it in a child, you're optimizing neurodevelopment. And this may explain why it is that children who grow up in a pro-inflammatory environment or under a lot of stress or other things that would tend to cause inflammation in the brain, lack of sleep, too many screens, etc., they have trouble learning. And they literally have lower testable IQs. And I believe that vagus nerve stimulation used in children, starting, whatever age you want. I started in my daughter at age 7, and I did it for reasons other than this. I did it because she had, inflammatory issues that were problems for her. What we saw in her cognitive development was remarkable. I mean, when I say remarkable, it was borderline miraculous. I mean, she is off the charts academically. And she'll tell you, if you talk with her, and I hope at some point you do, she'll tell you she remembers the way her brain worked when she was 7 years old. And she knows how it works now, and she knows exactly how it changed. She can remember, numbers. You give her a 10-digit number, she'll remember it. I mean, and not just, short term. It's in long-term memory. She didn't have that before. I mean, she was labeled as slow by her first grade teacher. By end of second grade, she did a biography on Einstein and was teaching her second grade class what Brownian motion was. She was explaining the photoelectric effect. She understood the difference between special and general relativity. And when I explained to her, the Young's two-slit study, she was like, how does the electron know where it's going? How does it know that you're looking at it? So, I mean, she was in second grade thinking these things. And I can tell you that was not going on in her brain a year earlier.
Future physicist, sounds like. We use similar stimulation protocols as you. The other part of that, though, is we used multiple different devices, some of which worked better than others. So what are your recommendations with regards to devices?
That's a politically charged question, but I will say this. There are multiple ways to stimulate the vagus nerve. Some are the natural ways that we've known for thousands of years, like, prana yoga breathing techniques and meditation and things like that. Those don't stimulate your vagus nerve anywhere near as powerfully as an electrical stimulation. There's a branch of the vagus nerve, and then there's the tragus nerve, both of which are in the ear. And they're close enough to the skin that there's auricular stimulation is possible. It's a very small number of fibers. It's only in a few hundred fibers that are traveling there. And they're also only afferent. They're only going up into the brain. And my understanding of the anatomy, and somebody else who's stronger at this can correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't go directly into the same places in the nucleus tractus solitarius that the cervical trunk of the vagus goes. The trunk of the vagus nerve that passes through on either side of the neck has hundreds of thousands of fibers, 80% of which are traveling up into the brainstem. So I do think that the brain is frequency coded, which means it's not necessarily going to be responsive just to the number of fibers that are stimulated. And I think that auricular stimulation does work for a number of things. But I think as the study that you just did, and we're referencing it, the Defense Language Institute showed that at least with respect to that work, there was not as profound or strong an effect with auricular stimulation as there was with cervical. I just think that naturally makes sense. There's a stronger signal coming up. There's more acetylcholine being released from the nucleus bacillus of Maynard, and as a result, it's a more efficient and quicker way of doing it. Is there a place for auricular stimulation? By all means, yes. Do I think it's necessarily going to work as well? I don't.
Could you tell us about Truvaga and its development and motivations?
Well, you guys are a big part of the motivation. We developed the product originally as GammaCore, which was a prescription product, and the safety profile was pretty awesome. I mean, it's just a very, very, very safe device. But if you want to label something and say it's treating a medical condition, then you have to go through the FDA and you have to get an approval. And the FDA said, listen, the medical conditions you're looking to treat are serious enough that it should be prescription only. And so the GammaCore is a prescription device. That doesn't mean that the therapy itself needs to be prescription only. It's sort of like Advil. You can buy a 100 or 200 milligram Advil over the counter. But if you want an 800 milligram Advil, you can either take 4 200 milligrams or you can get a prescription for an 800 milligram Advil. So that's sort of the difference between GammaCore and the device that ultimately we made, which is Truvaga. And the reason we did that was really because of you guys. You and the TNT program and DARPA and the military, they wanted a device that wasn't a prescription device. They wanted a wellness product, a product that wouldn't be labeled for a medical condition, but would be labeled for things like cognitive improvement or mood, elevation or, stress management. And so it took a little bit of cajoling. It took a little bit of work, but I was able to convince the powers that be now in the company that was a market that needed to be addressed and that we needed to have both the TAC-STIM product, which is what the military is using, as well as the Truvaga for the rest of the world. I mean, I ultimately think that it should be vitamin I. Everybody needs a little bit of current in their vagus nerve. You need a little vitamin I every day.
That's well said. And following up on that, I want to mention to our listeners, we mentioned it earlier briefly, but your book is really good, The Vagus Immune Connection. I read it this weekend, and it's a good read, covers a lot of ground, some of which we covered here today, but it goes beyond what we talked about today and in more depth. And so I commend it to the listeners.
Thank you.
And, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely, I'm sure as Tim has too. And thank you for joining us here on STEM Talk.
Anytime.
Now, we have one last question.
Okay.
All right. Did you ever resolve, you were beckoned to come downstairs?
Did I ever go down? I not only went downstairs, I ultimately, we ultimately left that house and bought a new one.
Oh.
That was not going to be my bachelor pad that she had to move into. So yes, absolutely.
Well, that's probably the right choice.
Yeah. And then we moved from New Jersey down to Florida.
Oh,
which was
another very
really good choice.
A really good choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you again for joining us on STEM Talk.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you,
Appreciate
JP.
it. Thanks.
Fabulous conversation.
Thank you.
Well done.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, first of all, thanks, Ken, for inviting me to help co-host this interview with JP. His research into vagus nerve stimulation and the many ways it can help regulate mood, learning, and our immune system, as well as cardiovascular functions, is rather eye-opening.
It is indeed. I also found it interesting how his research dovetails with a lot of the work we do here at IHMC regarding health span resilience and performance. As we have already discussed frequently on STEM Talk, stress has tremendous impact on our immune system and our metabolic health and so much else. It's quite fascinating how vagus nerve stimulation helps people not only relieve stress and anxiety, but also helps them shift their bodies into a more balanced state that promotes health. It will be interesting to watch how JP's research and his many inventions evolve over the coming years.
This is Tim Broderick signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.